Presidency, demographic, and personal characteristics. So as of 2021, 45 people have served as President of the United States. Grover Cleveland is the only one to have served 2 non-consecutive terms, and so he counts twice, which is why President Biden is the 46th president, even though he is 45th person to hold the office. Why am I doing this particular presentation? I think that learning about the demographics of presidents sheds light on the broader political and social processes in the United States. So let's look at the word demographic and try to parse it. Demos means people, to graph is to describe. So we're trying to describe presidents as people, as how they fit into the social fabric of the United States. Then from there, we can make broader inferences about political and social system of the country. So all presidents up to this point were men, and that's unusual for democracies. The vast majority of democracies had at least one woman as their top leader, as president or prime minister. All except Obama were white. All were Christian, with the exception of Thomas Jefferson, who might be more accurately considered a deist rather than a Christian. After Harry Truman, all had a college degree. All were middle-aged or old. The youngest ever was Teddy Roosevelt, who became president at the shockingly young age of 42, after President McKinley was assassinated by a terrorist in September of 1901. Teddy Roosevelt, as his vice president, ascended to the office of the president. The youngest ever elected was JFK. He was 43. And as far as governmental experience is concerned, all except one, that's Donald Trump, had prior government experience before being elected president. Presidents are getting older, so if you look at the age of presidents-elect, Reagan was 68 when he was elected in November of 1980, and he turned 69 the same months that he became president in 1981. Trump was 70 when he was elected, and Biden was 77, a few weeks shy of his 78th birthday. So presidents seem to be getting a bit older. Many presidents have familial relations to one another. We had 2 sets of father and son. President John Adams, our 2nd president, President John Quincy Adams, the 6th president. Then you had George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president, and his son, George W. Bush, the 43rd president. We had 1 set of grandfather-grandson, President William Henry Harrison, 9th president, and Benjamin Harrison, the 23rd president. And then we had second cousins, James Madison and Zachary Taylor, and we had distant cousins, Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We came very close to having a husband-wife set of presidents, and that was Bill Clinton and almost Hillary Clinton, but she lost to Donald Trump in 2016, or we would have had our first husband-wife connection. Successful versus failed presidents. So there's a set of factors that historians and political scientists tend to identify as distinguishing or differentiating between those presidents who are successful and those that have failed. So let's briefly review each one. The first factor is how well or how badly the president performed in a crisis, particularly a major crisis like a war or a severe recession or even economic depression. So since not all presidents have actually presided during a crisis, this is a little bit unfair to those who did not preside in a crisis because they cannot be evaluated based on this criteria. The second criteria is how effective the president was in working with Congress to get things done. So some presidents have been very effective and they have been able to accomplish much of their agenda, while others saw their agenda basically stall in Congress and they ended up being ineffectual as presidents. The next factor is to what extent president is able to minimize corruption within his administration. it is not possible to eliminate all corruption. Corruption is to some extent a part of life and therefore also part of politics and public administration. But some administrations have been relatively free of corruption, whereas others have been submerged in it. And the fourth characteristic is how or to what extent the overall legacy is assessed after many years have passed since the president left office. So almost every credible historian and political scientist will agree that Lincoln, Washington, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt have to be considered among the top three. So the exact ranking here is not crucial, but typically they come in this order: Lincoln, Washington, Roosevelt. Other presidents who are typically among the top 10 are Teddy Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Thomas Jefferson. So clearly Lincoln would be considered among the greats because he presided during the greatest crisis in American history, where the country actually fell apart. And Lincoln, as president, played a crucial role in putting it back together again. And he paid with his life for it. And he did so while most likely overcoming bouts of serious depression. Second was George Washington. He was the father of the country. He was the first president of the United States. Some of his prior achievements as the general of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and then as the president of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, which produced the U.S. Constitution in 1787, all of that, I think, bleeds through into the evaluation of his presidency, which shouldn't affect it. But if you still look at just his presidency alone, he should be considered a very successful president. He set the precedent for serving just 2 terms. He could have been president for life if he wanted to, but he said 2 terms and that's it, and he left. And also, he was a successful administrator. He was able to recognize talent and intellectual abilities that were superior to his own, like those of Jefferson and Hamilton, both of whom worked for him in his administration. Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury and Jefferson as Secretary of State. And even though Hamilton and Jefferson disliked each other, Washington was able to get them to work in the same administration and to listen to their judgment when necessary. And then you have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, of course, presided effectively first over the Great Depression and then over U.S. participation in the Second World War. And by the time he died in April of 1945, the United States was already many years out of the Depression. Depression pretty much ended by 1940. And the success in World War II was already assured by spring of 1945. So Roosevelt is considered successful president for that reason. And he was the only one in all of American history who was elected to more than 2 terms in office. He was elected to 4 terms in office. He could not be defeated. He was carried out of the White House in a coffin. So after Roosevelt's presidency, Congress got the idea to create a constitutional amendment which would limit presidents to just 2 terms in office, and that amendment would be ratified in February of 1951. Teddy Roosevelt was very active, energetic as president. He stood up to new wealth, to big corporations. He tried to prevent the creation of economic trusts. Harry Truman, because his administration was virtually almost free of corruption, and Thomas Jefferson, because he nearly doubled the size of the country due to Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Presidents who are occasionally ranked among the greats, among the top 10, would be Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan, Andrew Jackson, and sometimes James Madison. Now, alongside successes, we also have to keep in mind that there were failures. And the following list of failures, I think, would be agreed on by pretty much all serious historians and political scientists. They are James Buchanan, Warren Harding, Ulysses Grant, Andrew Johnson, and Herbert Hoover. So, for example, Harding's and Hoover's administrations were pretty much submerged. Harding's and Grant's administrations were pretty much submerged in corruption. Andrew Johnson and Herbert Hoover and James Buchanan were, all three of them, ineffectual as presidents for different reasons. James Buchanan, because he was just very passive as president. He failed to recognize the severity of the crisis that the country was undergoing due to the issue of slavery. He was unprepared for what would happen after the November election of 1860, when Lincoln was elected and the country began to fall apart. Soon thereafter, within weeks of Lincoln's election, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and the size of the United States Army was tiny and was unable the U.S. Army was unable to act quickly. So James Buchanan was ineffective as president. Andrew Johnson, because nobody liked Andrew Johnson in Congress. Johnson was a Southern Democrat who was Lincoln's vice president on the National Union ticket, but National Union was really euphemism for a Southern Democrat. He was a pro-union Southern Democrat. In Southern states, particularly in certain regions, there was, even during the Civil War, a pretty strong undercurrent of pro-unionism. And in certain parts, like in northern Alabama, in parts of Tennessee where Andrew Johnson was from, there was a strong pro-union sentiment, and Andrew Johnson represented that. I think he was the only Southern senator not to have left the Senate during the during the Southern secession between December of 1860 and March of 1861. So what happened with Johnson, of course, is accidental presidency. Tragically, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson ascended into Lincoln's office, whereas Congress was controlled by so-called radical Republicans. And these Republicans, they hated Andrew Johnson, and he hated them back. And there was a impeachment engineered against him. He was impeached, but the Senate failed to convict by one vote. And so Andrew Johnson was ineffective as president because he simply could not work with Congress effectively. And then you had Herbert Hoover, who was too slow to act when the Great Depression hit. After the stock market crash of October 1929, the unemployment rate began to climb. And this is the way that modern economics tends to work in advanced societies, that finance is the bellwether for the rest of the economy. When the finance is on the rise, the rest of the economy will catch up with it eventually. When the finance is on the decline, the rest of the economy will eventually go down with it. And this second scenario is what happened between late 1929 and 1932. And in 1932, the unemployment rate rose to just about 25%. Herbert Hoover was slow to act. Millions of middle-class people fell into poverty, and previously prosperous areas became known as Hoovervilles to mark Herbert Hoover as the villain who failed to act to prevent slums from being formed, from preventing bread lines from being formed, from preventing this rise of desperation, economic desperation that befell the country due to the Great Depression. Recent surveys also indicate that George W. Bush was a failed president. Bush got the United States into two wars, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq, the second of which tends to be more controversial than the first one. And these wars have cost already around $7-8 trillion with dubious results. Now, personal characteristics. The following are personal characteristics of successful presidents: ambition, energy, flexibility, intelligence, and vision. Now, Today, in the 21st century, ambition really is a requirement to even become president in the first place. This was not always the case in American history. You didn't have to be terribly ambitious to become president before. The dynamics was different. We'll talk about it in detail when we discuss campaigns and elections. But in the olden days, you didn't even have to go through the system of primaries to be nominated for president by your own party. And sometimes people of moderate ambition could actually become president, as exactly what happened to Warren Harding. But if you want to be president now, you have to be ambitious. If you want to be successful, you have to be ambitious. Second, you have to have a lot of energy. This job is exhausting. And as president, your day is never done. I mean, you can work as much as you possibly can because the world never stops spinning. And the United States is so big and so complex as a society, as an economy. And it plays such a huge role in the world in which there are roughly 200 countries right now. So as president, your plate is full, and it's a very stressful job because there's always somebody, some groups, some powerful interests who are dead set against you and with whose interests you have to contend. So it's an extremely stressful job. Next is flexibility. This one is often maligned by people who think that flexibility is opposed to being principled, and that's not necessarily the case. Being flexible does not mean that you give up being principled. It simply means that you recognize that there are limitations as to what you can accomplish if you only stand on your principles. Flexibility means that you can recognize when and how you can accommodate the interests of others, even though you may not agree at all or may not fully agree with their point of view or with the direction in which they want to go. So society being complex and the world is being very complex, you have to know how to read the situation. You have to know how to read people and groups and make decisions that are wise, meaning decisions that will accomplish as much good for your vision and for the country as you reasonably can, and not sell yourself and your program short. But also don't be overly ambitious. Know your limitations. Know how to compromise. This is especially true in a big democracy like the United States. If you cannot be flexible and compromise, then you cannot be successful as president. Next one is intelligence. No president in US history probably lacked intelligence. Some were smarter than others, but all of them were fairly intelligent. So that hasn't been an issue, I would say. But in terms of real creative intelligence, in terms of original thinking, I think there's only been three. And those are Woodrow Wilson, Thomas Jefferson, and maybe James Madison, but Abraham Lincoln for sure. So these three, maybe four if you count Madison. People are not just of great intelligence, but also intelligence that goes hand in hand with originality and creative thinking. And by the way, I do not insist at all. In fact, I'm certain that creativity and original thinking are not necessary in order to be a successful president, because much of the job of the president is really administrative and in nature. It's a role of a manager and an organizer, much more so than a creative thinker. And next one is vision. Where there's no vision, people perish. So you have to know where you want to take the country. If you know where you want to go, you're much more likely to actually get there. If you don't have vision, you kind of bumble around and you eventually fail as president. Assassinations. Now, assassinations and assassination attempts tell us a lot about the nature of the job of the president and even the nature of the country. There have been four assassinations. Those of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, James Garfield in 1881, William McKinley in 1901, and John F. Kennedy in 1963. In addition, there have been many assassination attempts and many more plans which never even became attempts. There have been two assassination attempts, for example, against President Gerald Ford alone, and Ford has only been an accidental president, and he became president after Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal, and Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned because of the scandal stemming from his earlier service as governor of Maryland. So you have this person, Gerald Ford, ascending first to vice presidency, then becoming president, and in 2 years, two different women, for two different reasons, tried to kill him, and both missed. But there have been many close calls, like assassination attempt by John Hinckley against Ronald Reagan in 1981, and then assassination attempts against Teddy Roosevelt after he was shot point blank. And even though he was bleeding, he continued on with his speaking engagement and only then went to the hospital, lost a lot of blood, but he survived. There have been assassination attempts against many others, like against President Truman, when Puerto Rican nationalists tried to kill him. Assassination attempt against Andrew Jackson, when an assassin carrying two pistols tried to shoot him point blank, but both pistols jammed. And Andrew Jackson then attacked him with his cane, beat him up pretty good. So there have been many, many attempts. I think what this tells us is that as president, you are the symbol of the country and you have a bullseye painted on your back. And a lot of people want to assassinate the president, some for political reasons, some because they're just crazy. Political assassinations include those of Abraham Lincoln and William McKinley. Lincoln was very clearly killed by John Wilkes Booth out of political considerations. Booth was angry that Lincoln destroyed Southern society. "All my life is for the South," said John Wilkes Booth. And McKinley was killed by an anarchist. Those are obviously political motivations. They're driven by political grievances and political ideology. But if you look at assassinations of James Garfield and John F. Kennedy, all the available data indicates that they were actually carried out by mentally unstable people. So if you have a big country like the United States, and you have one person, the president, who symbolizes that country, who is its living, breathing symbol, then you are going to have people, for political considerations or due to mental health issues, trying to kill the president. So president needs to have a lot of protection. So that is the presentation on demographic characteristics of American presidents.